Hey everyone, welcome to Festive Tech Calendar 2022. My name is Peter Detender and I'm going to walk you through a somewhat live coding of building a Marvel hero app using Blazor WebAssembly and publishing it into Azure Static Web Apps. It's actually honestly going to be one of my first public development projects, knowing that I'm actually not a developer. So what are we going to do? Explaining a little bit like what is .NET Blazor about. Then the biggest part is obviously helping you understanding what it takes to actually build that application using Blazor WebAssembly, and we're going to build it from scratch and then eventually publishing it into Azure Static Web Apps. So if you're wondering who I am, so Peter Detender, you already know. I'm actually a Marvel Comics fan since the mid 80s when I was probably about 12 years old. I'm currently working as a Microsoft technical trainer. Recently, about a year back, early 2022, relocated to Redmond and originally from Belgium. The core trainings that I'm delivering is Azure Architecture and DevOps, but out of that also taking a little bit of a sidestep into the developer world, where I started learning .NET probably about 18 months back, and started with Blazor Server, Blazor WebAssembly, and I tried to combine, I would say, my new passion for the little bit of developing that I can do in meantime, together with the Marvel passion that I have. And in the free time, besides writing and testing and trying out to write some new apps, I'm also a technical writer on Azure, book publisher, and overall blogger. So with that, let's jump in. What is Blazor? So Blazor is something still pretty new. I would say it's developed probably about 3 years back now, if you look at the early days of Blazor, and it exists in two different flavors. Now there's Blazor Server and Blazor WebAssembly. Blazor Server overall is a web framework for building web UI components, what we call Razor components, and they can be hosted in several different ways. The Razor components can run server-side ASP.NET Core, what we call Blazor Server, together with client-side, and that's what we call WebAssembly. Now the Razor pages coming from the C#.NET language allow you to build applications for the browser, but also mobile and full desktop applications. So the same Razor components that you might already have for more traditional applications can now be moved into your browser as well. Now the way it works, in short, you have your Blazor components, so technically .NET framework under the hood, together with the Razor pages, and I'll walk you through the actual developing piece of that, where you're having that sending back and forth communication to a full-blown ASP.NET server, where it's using SignalR connection. The second option is using WebAssembly. Now WebAssembly allows you to run full 100% client-side in the browser. So what it means is that your .NET runtime is 100% running in the browser. You might recognize that model where we're not using the .NET language, but actually coming from JavaScript. So if you think about like React or Vue, or something similar to that, that's technically what Blazor WebAssembly is now doing out of the .NET family. So the app is 100% running in the browser interface, which means that you don't need that server backend anymore. I'm not going to share more details about the real differences between server and the Blazor WebAssembly, but for now I would say server means I need a full-blown ASP.NET server backend, where WebAssembly means I just need a browser, and that's going to allow me to run my applications. So that's pretty much it on the introduction. So let's jump in and share a little bit more about what I'm actually gonna develop. So in short, there's like 3-4 different steps. The first step is starting from the Blazor WebAssembly, what we call boilerplate template, which means I'm gonna open up Visual Studio, selecting Blazor WebAssembly template, and starting from there. Then we're gonna write code, where the code itself is a combination of HTML, using CSS a little bit for the layout, and .NET 7. Then the core component out of my Blazor WebAssembly is connecting to the developer.marvel.com REST APIs using HTTP client, and eventually I'm going to publish my application into Azure Static Web Apps. So let's have a look. So with that, let's get started, right? So I'm using Visual Studio 2022. If you want to follow along and literally going through the project together with me, you could actually download Visual Studio 2022 Community Edition for free. Or if you have a license, then obviously the Professional or Premium Edition would work as well. So let's create a new project where we're gonna search for Blazor. That's the technology we're using. And there's a couple of options here. So you can see we have Blazor server application, we have Blazor WebAssembly, and we also have the empty project. Now, or the empty templates. Now I'm gonna use the Blazor WebAssembly up here, and I could start from an empty scenario, but I always like to go back to, I would say, the more comfortable scenario where I know that at least the basic template is working. Now, I'm not saying that the template is not working at all. It just makes your life a little bit easier because it already has like the full project up and running, and we just need to make some edits into the actual pages that we're gonna use. So select Blazor WebAssembly, and I'm gonna store this on my local machine. As you can see, I already tried this out, but for now, let's do the Festive Blazor 2022. And I'll call it a live edition. It's not really live, I know it's recorded, but at least for me, it's all gonna be live with no real edits. And let's move on. I'm gonna take one step back and let's call our project also Festive Blazor 2022 Live. There we go. Click next. I'm gonna use .NET 7 over here. Now you could use .NET 6, .NET 7. Technically, there's a lot of differences that I'm not gonna talk about here. In a full production environment, I think .NET 7 is okay, but it's typically renewed. So next year, in about a year from now, we have .NET 8 most probably coming up. So for a full production environment, we might actually recommend .NET 6 because it's the long-term strategy. And that's what you find over here as well. But for now, let's go with the latest and select .NET 7. Giving it about a second, there we go. So what we have from here is our base application out of that template. So obviously what we should do from here is testing if everything works out fine. So we go into our HTTPS link, running some debugging, and I wouldn't even say if everything works out fine, because technically it's just a template, right? So I'm gonna give this a little minute. Compilation starts. I'm gonna kill this for a second just to speed it up a little bit. And the first thing we get here in the Blazor template out of .NET 7, actually something new, is that loading animation. And as you can see, the app is already working. So from here we have our index page. And as you can see, it allows you right out of the box to perform some API calls to some external weather forecast or anything else. Like in our example, we're gonna run some API calls to the Marvel developers API backend. Good, but this works. So we're gonna stop this for now. And let's start with building some of our actual application. So what we have here on the side, maybe I can start with that as well for the ones who don't really know what Blazor is about. So we have our project. I'm only gonna use one. It's a WebAssembly, which means everything's getting compiled and running directly in a browser, which means we don't need a server backend. There's some, I would say, benefits and maybe some drawbacks depending on what the app needs to do. But in our case, it's only performing some API calls. So perfect example for WebAssembly, referring to the single page application concept. Now within the Blazor WebAssembly, we have the pages where it's using Razor. Now Razor is something that's been around for a while, and I would say, but again, I'm still learning every single day about becoming a developer, and Razor has been around for a while, and it just accepts all the traditional C# code. So if you're a .NET developer using C#, apparently it shouldn't be too hard to migrate from traditional MVC applications into the Blazor world. Now what we're doing from here, I could create a new page. I'm just going to use the index, it's the default one. And once everything is getting rendered, it's getting moved into that W root, like the traditional web folder, where you can see that the index HTML is technically not doing anything more than just loading some bootstrap information, reading out the style sheet information, and picking up that loading progress. So that's a little bit what you've seen in that first template test. So let's dive into our application here. And what we're going to do is adding some placeholders for our Marvel search application. So let's get it started. We have our page. So this means if my Blazor web page is loading, or the application itself is loading, I want you to start from the home page. So if I would create, let's say, a page called marvel.razor, I would need to create a route where it could be something like /Marvel, for example. So that's how it finds the way to the different pages. So from here, what we're going to do is editing a little bit of code, and that's going to be our first piece. And it means we're going to write some updated title. So let's do H1. And in between, we're going to call this the Blazor Marvel Finder. Why not? You can add some classes, so that's integrating some CSS if you want. If you want to make it a little bit nicer looking, you could say. That's what you would do here. And as you can see, it's immediately resolving. So we're going to do something in the center and the primary title. There we go. And that's going to be Blazor Marvel Finder. Way good. Now next, I want to present like a little search field. So we need to add some code into that part as well. So I'm going to use a div class for this one. And I'm still going to center it out. As you can see, I got my IntelliSense up and running, which makes it just a little bit easier. Now the funny thing is, and I still don't really know where it comes from, but it tries to help me a little bit. And the funny thing is that since I obviously have been working on this Marvel app, that my IntelliSense here is trying to become smarter. But for now, we're not going to do that. I'm not going to reuse like parts of that suggestion, because it doesn't always make a lot of sense for now. And next, we're going to add a little placeholder. There we go. Closing it out. And in between, we're going to add an input field where the class equals form control smart. You could probably turn this all off, but every now and then you'll see later on that I'm actually going to use some of the suggestions. So I'm not going to turn it off completely. Form control LG, then we define the width. So 50, I think, would be okay. And for next, we have a placeholder where we're going to provide some text telling the user like what we want to expect in that search field. So this could be enter Marvel character name. Good. And closing it out, I assume. Oh, I already got the div. Nice. Next, let's start a new div where we have another class open, and it already assumes that we need a button to actually trigger the search. So I'm just going to accept all this. Let's see. So we have a button primary, button OK, and there's an on click where this is probably something like find Marvel, although we don't have it yet, and a description for the button. I'm going to leave out the on click for now. I'll add it back later on, because otherwise it will throw an error when we're compiling it. And this is the find your Marvel hero. And I think that's about it. I'm gonna save my changes and let's see what we have until now. Oh, we missed apparently something. Let's see. Div class text center. So apparently I forgot to close. Obviously I need to close my div from here. Looks like my layout is already a little bit wrong there. This div is closing, this one, and then obviously we need one all the way at the end. Oh, thank you for helping me. I think that's gonna fix the problem. Nice, nice. And running it again. So if all works out fine, we should get a little update in our web page that allows me to actually search for it, although there's nothing behind the button yet. But at least we're going to see the title and we're going to have that little search field. Look at that, Blazor Marvel Finder, that's the title. We have our search field and the Find Marvel Hero, but obviously when I click the button, it's not doing anything yet because we didn't write the code for that yet. Now the layout is fine. I mean, for now it's good enough. You could obviously make this a lot more complex. Now the next thing is, so when we're clicking that button, it's going to make an API call to the Marvel Developer API catalog, and it's going to return some answers. Now you could just create a table. There's actually a new feature in Blazor for .NET 7 called Grid View, but it's just a table. And I think for this one, I probably like a little bit nicer layout, like showing a little card. And then from there, it's going to show up all the different cards for all the different heroes we have. Now, just for this one, I'm going to make it a little bit easier for myself and copying a little snippet of code, but I'll walk you through and explaining what it actually does. There we go. So in short, what it does here is creating a container class. So showing like a little box, literally a container, where within the container, we're going to use the layout for a card and we're going to pull up an image. Now for now, it's just an empty placeholder. So it's going to make a call to that via placeholder.com and showing like a default image because we don't have an image coming back from the Marvel environment yet. Next to that, I also want to add the name of the Marvel character, and in the details of the card, I want to show the character details. So for now, let's run this again because we don't have any issues in the code. And I'm quickly going to show you what the code looks like. Dun, 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 dun. App is spinning up. There we go, cool. And I'll quickly move this to a full screen. So again, the idea is we start searching one of our characters over here, clicking to find your Marvel hero. And for now, it's only placing one card over here. But obviously the idea is that if, let's say, we run a search for any Marvel character, Thor, Wolverine, or so any of the other ones, that obviously there can be more than one. Why? Because in the backend of that Marvel API call, it's going to pull up like movie characters, comic characters, anything from the series, which means that we definitely going to get more than one response coming back. At least one, but maybe more. And we need to take that into account a little bit later on when we're running the code. Good, so this works. Now the other thing that we can do, I created my initial layout, like the upper part. Next to that, stopped it, debugging it again, testing it out, and so on and so on. So what we can do is, again, something new in our .NET environment. In Visual Studio, it's using hot reload. Now what this does is actually saving you some time because depending a bit on the changes, and you'll see that throughout the recording, it's not always going to ask me to save it, stop it, restarting the application. So I'm going to enable hot reload. And for example, I could edit something in my environment. So instead of providing like the find your Marvel hero, let's do Marvel character. I'm pretty sure they're all heroes, but now whenever I'm just gonna save it, and I'm gonna switch back over here, within just a couple of seconds, you can see that over here, that find your Marvel character now got updated without me needing to stop it, running it again, testing it. So it's going to save you a little bit of time. It's not always, I would say, the most important feature, but on the other side, definitely going to save you some time. Which means now I can minimize my app and I can just continue editing my source code. Okay, let's see. So we have the layout, we have the card, and I think the next piece is adding the link between the search field and the triggering the button. So remember from before that our little IntelliSense tried to help me here a little bit, and adding a bind value. So what the bind value is doing is actually linking the outcome of bind value, the outcome of the field, let's call it bind value equals who to find. And I'm going to close this out. Oh, actually interesting that it didn't complain about that before. Well, now it's telling me like, well, you want to add that who to find. So I'm going to store this in a variable. And obviously from here, it's going to tell me like, oh, wait a minute, you have an attribute, but I cannot find it. Why not? Because it's not part of the actual source code yet, but we'll add it in a second. And then the other piece we need is having an actual action behind the button itself. So what I'm going to do here is adding an onClick event where again the IntelliSense tried to help me before, but for now I think we can just add it over here. No, Peter, it's not over there. It needs to be over here at onClick. There we go, equals, and we're going to call this the why not find Marvel? Because that's what we want to do. We want to find Marvel or finding characters. Now, when I'm saving it again, as you can see here, since we started editing a little bit more in the code, not just the layout anymore, it's warning me out of that hot reload, like, well, you made some edits and I need to run a new compile. So that's what I mentioned before, that depending a bit on the changes you're making, you might need to go through some recompile again. But I think for now, we can actually add some real code into our Blazor application. So let's move on. And the nice thing here with Blazor, but it's technically coming from Razor pages, is that you can actually combine HTML, CSS layout together with the actual code. So what you need is a little code placeholder, and that's where you're going to write your actual C#.NET code intelligence. So what we need is a string where we're going to store our who to find. That's the outcome of the search field, and we need to trigger a task. That's going to be an async task. That's the typical one for making API calls to some backend system. And we're going to call this the find Marvel, because that's what we defined in the on-click scenario behind the button. And for now, why not? We can test it out to see if the button is actually doing something by routing to our local console. So if this is like, I would say the same as for me, still pretty new in the developer world, I think the console write line is probably one of the easiest to validate if your code is actually working. And we're going to do the who to find. Looks good to me. I'm going to save it. It's not really doing anything yet. Now, it didn't complain, but I'm just going to close it and validate what actually happened. So there's nothing with like closing and starting Visual Studio again, and apparently that fixes the issue. So let's just run it again for now to make sure that everything is actually working as it should be. So while this is starting up, what we did is creating that who to find bind value. So which means if we store a value in that search field, we want to hand that over to the button action as a variable name, as an attribute. So let's see if that writes something to the console, because that's what I wanted to test for now. So let's search for example, Thor, find your Marvel character. Everything looks good, and checking back in our console over here. So we have the app up and running, and when we search for a character, you can see up here that it's recognizing the Thor search. So that means the button is working and the search field itself is also working. Good, good. So this technically means that I would say the first part of the app building is already done. So let's move over to the second piece, and that's where we're going to connect to the Marvel APIs. So what you need is connecting to developer.marvel.com, get a key, because obviously the login is protected, so not just anyone can read out information. But the nice thing is that you don't have to pay for this, so it actually allows you like 3,000 API calls per day or something, so more than enough in just building a sample application. And the steps to authenticate to create that account are pretty straightforward, so I'm not going to bore you with all that. So once we have our account up and running, it's presenting our key information. Now, obviously, I'm using the keys to build my app, but later on, I'm obviously creating new keys just to give you some comfort there. So what we can do from here is running 3,000 calls a day for free, and we also need to specify our domains. So by design, it's accepting the developer.marvel.com and anything from marvel.com. And just to be able to test the application, the API calls from the local machine, I also added localhost into it, because otherwise it's typically and obviously gonna throw an API call error message. So once we have this part done, we can actually move on and running some API testing. So there's a pretty nice interactive API tester that they provide, and we have a lot of options here. So I'm gonna use the first one to just read out the specific characters. That's like the only thing I'm pulling up for now. But as you can see, there's a lot more options. So if you want to build your own, I don't know, Marvel fan web application, know that besides just reading out character information, you can actually read out a lot more, specifically for comics, for the creators, reading out event series, and so much more. So what I'm going to do is using the characters link API call, and from there you can see that it's giving you out of the box already quite some feedback. So I'm not interested in all the information, but I'll show you later on how to filter that. Now the nice thing with the API tester is that you can use any of the search query information, where I'm going to use the name starts with. Why? Because it's like one of the easiest to just provide some part of the name, like Spider-Man could be a good one to use, where you could just use like SPI for searching for anything that's Spider-Man, but also Spider-Woman, for example. So that's what it allows me to do here. Now we used Thor in our previous examples, so why not using it again? And I'm gonna live try it out here. So the request query is an important piece that we'll reuse later on. So what we have is the first part, that's probably always the same. Name starts with, that's the key I'm using. This is the field Thor, that's my attribute. So later on we need to come up with translating the field search parameter we defined. And we also need to provide our API key. So there's a part, URL gateway, that's fixed. Name starts with is fixed. And then integrating that attribute who to find, followed by our API key. And if everything works out fine, we should get a nice response back where you can see that it's using JSON. Now what we need on our application side is the HTTP client. Now HTTP client is overall what I would say typically ASP.NET is using to perform API calls. There's a few other options. You can also integrate other NuGet packages if you don't want to use or you don't like to use the default one. But for the purpose of that, I want to use it, reading out, capturing JSON feedback and running some deserialization, it actually works more than good enough. So what we need is defining our default URL as the base address in our HTTP client. So within the Blazor WebAssembly, we have our program CS, that's like the starting point for our Blazor application. And over here you can see that out of the box, it already comes with an HTTP client. Now there's a couple of different ways to use HTTP client. What I'm doing here is just connecting to one URL, but if you want, you could also add named-based HTTP clients, let's say one call for Marvel and another call for, I don't know, something else, right? Where you could provide additional configuration settings. But I'm going to use the default for now. And this means what I'm going to do is I'm replacing that base address variable over here into that actual Marvel API. Because in the end, it's just a fixed URL that we have anyway. So let me copy this over from my notes, just making my life a little bit easier instead of just typing in that address URL. And it should be that https gateway.marvel.com 443 v1 public. That's literally what we need. And we probably need to add some additional steps. Let's see, builder, that's all the same. We didn't touch that one. Builder services scope, new HTTP client, base address equals new URI. Oh, we are missing our quotes. That's the little piece of magic. It's interesting, right, with the IntelliSense that every now and then it's complaining about it, and then eventually it's allowing you to recognize it. Where now I just added this one, and then interesting enough, it's just adding its own little character there. And everything's back to green. Cool, that's what we needed. Next, we need to tell our HTTP client, we need to tell our Blazor page, the index razor page, that it needs to use what we call dependency injection. What this means is that when we're gonna load the page, like reading out all the information in the index.razor, that it needs to load that HTTP client. The way to do that is quite straightforward. So we already had our page over here, and we're going to make a new call called inject. And the inject is not the JavaScript runtime. Thank you, Visual Studio, for trying to help, but it is HTTP client, and we need to give it a name, and I'm just going to use HTTP client for that. So what we're doing here is inject HTTP client from the services in that program.cs. And we're going to give it a name called HTTP client. You can give this any particular name that you want, but I'm not going to make it harder than it should be. Good, now we're back on the Marvel side, because what we have for now is a pretty extensive, somewhat complex JSON file. Now what we need on our application side is creating a class that recognizes all the content from the JSON payload. Now there's a couple of different ways to do that. One of the ways that I like to use is a free website called JSON to C#. And what we're going to do is copying that full response. And this is pretty long, so we copy the whole JSON response in this little website, and we're going to convert it. Now what it does here is translating all the JSON payload structure into nice C# recognizable classes. Now I told you before, we don't really need all the information. Why? Just for the sample app, I'm mainly interested in the name of the character, little description of the Marvel character, and the title, and also that little image. So what we should be able to do here is selecting everything from that payload and creating a new payload class in our application. So let's start with following some best practice. So let's create a new folder where we would typically call this models. That's what our C#.net recommends. And we're going to add a new item, and that's going to be our, let's say, Marvel results .cs for the classes. There we go. Now again, you could copy like the whole JSON payload. I'm not going to do that because again, I don't really need everything in there. So I'm going to grab a little snippet of code that I copied on the side, just to speed it up and make it a little bit easier. So what I'm doing here is reading out some base information That's coming from that JSON payload called result, where I'm using an ID, like the ID of the character, the name of the character, a quick description, and the thumbnail. Where the public image over here is technically reading out the path, so that's where in the Marvel backend, where to find the image and eventually the actual image itself. So wrapping up the classes into a shorter JSON layout. So that's the main thing I would say that we're doing here. Next, we need to tell our application like how to recognize the find and where to store the results. So let me go back to my Marvel results. So what I have here is a public class Marvel results in which it's going to store the JSON payload feedback. Now we need to move that Marvel results into something recognizable for the code itself. So what we need to do here is adding a new string where we're going to store our Marvel result. So we do private Marvel results, and we give that a new name called Marvel result. And we're going to reuse that later on. Now here you can see that it's again complaining. Now I know how to fix this because it's like, wait a minute, you want me to use that Marvel result namespace, but I don't know where I need to find it. So what you can do here is using the Visual Studio helper a little bit. I'll show you how to do that. Normally it's coming up just like that, but for now, obviously it doesn't like it. Come on, refresh, you can do this. Good, looks like it works. So what we have is obviously the name public class Marvel results, and that name should reflect over here as well. So that's where it was struggling a little bit. Good, ready to move on, because what we need is now a little piece of code in our code section where we're going to run that actual API call. Now, as you remember, we had that API string as part of our query. So what we're going to do here, no, we don't want you to find Spider-Man. Thank you for helping, but not yet. It's actually pretty cool that it tries to recognize Spider-Man there. So we're going to do private string Marvel API key, or just API key. No, let's call it Marvel API key equals and we're going to copy over the private key from the Marvel website. And then next in our actual task, we're going to keep the right line for now, although technically we don't really need it anymore. But we're going to provide it a new variable called URL, because that's what we need to hand over to our API call. And a combination, so we need to start with a $sign, and we're going to paste in that actual Marvel API key parameter. Now technically it recognizes parts of our environment, but we don't need all this. Why not? Because we already defined that as part of our baseline URL in the program CS. So this piece can be removed, at least up to the public. There we go. So we're going to start with characters. Name starts with, that's the API query setting we're going to use. Using the who to find, adding the API key, and it's called Marvel API key, where obviously this API key over here is coming from over here. So that should work fine. And then we need to send our information into that Marvel result string, which means we're going to run an await. I'm not going to use the suggestion here. I'm just going to try and write out the full setting. So we're going to await HTTP client call, where it's a get from JSON async, where we have our Marvel results. Thank you for helping. And the result is coming from the URL together with a new system text JSON. Thank you. And the JSON serialization options. Now what it's doing here is like sending the request knowing that there is some JSON payload coming back. So what we need to add here is some policies. Now, I never really looked into this, to be honest. I just know that it works if I use the correct settings. There's a lot of details in the docs to explain what it's actually doing. So let me first complete this. It's not the property name case, but I'm going to use the property name policy, where the policy equals the system.text.json. And then we're going to call the JSON policy, naming policy. And camel case looks okay. And then the closing brackets, all cool, cool, cool. And that should be it for now. Just running a little validation here. Good, I think it's fine. Because we're gonna send this full URL. The HTTP client already has the base address URL, and we're gonna add this character's name starts with, who to find, and so on and so on. That looks good. Now with all the code done, you can see there's some other warnings here, you could say. Instead of having the red squiggly line, the green one means like, well, I'm gonna warn you about it. It's not really blocking you from compiling and running the code, but there might be some options to fix this. The same actually is valid for the Marvel results and the who to find. Now what it shows you here is a little pop-up box where it explains the non-nullable field. What it technically means is that when I'm spinning up my application, when my app is running, it somehow knows that I'm not always forcing anyone to enter something. Now, technically, I think it would be recommended to update the code and actually move it out, like not accepting any nullable results, like please don't search for any empty fields. But for now, the easy fix is updating the settings of my project. So what you can do here is just double clicking on the project and changing the nullable to disable, or the other approach is from the Visual Studio properties, where you can search for nullable over here and moving this to disable. Now again, in a full production environment, I wouldn't really recommend you doing that. It's actually a check that got introduced in .NET 6, if I'm not mistaken. But for now, I think it is fine to just leave it as a disabled state. And this should result, oh, let me close this. And this means that the squiggly lines are gone. Cool, cool. I'm gonna save it for now. And the other piece that we need to update in the code is creating a little array in our response. Remember, in our index upper part, so we have the layout. So the first part here is the search field where we knew everything was working. And the second piece is where we're gonna store the feedback. Now I told you that out of that JSON response, we could get one or more responses, unless we're gonna search for a character that doesn't really exist, or maybe you're mixing up, I don't know, DC Comics with Marvel Comics and searching for the wrong superheroes, which means that now we're gonna make it a little bit smarter. So what we're gonna do here is on top of the container, right before, we're gonna add a little if statement. So if our Marvel result is not equal to null, like meaning if you get some feedback, and IntelliSense is helping here again, but I'm not going to use it. So if that Marvel result is different from null, meaning there is actually some feedback, I'm going to create that container. I'm going to create a row, but next to that, I also need to create that loop, like a for each scenario, which means if there's more than one coming back, I want you to create multiple cards. So let's add for each. Let's see var Marvel in results, but I don't need all that other stuff, so I'm just gonna type it in. var result in that Marvel result data results. That's the class feedback we got. I want you to create that little loop here, and then eventually we're going to close the loop over here and all the way at the end as well for my if statement. Cool, that's closed. Now here we can also add some additional variable settings, because now it's not the Marvel hero name, but we're gonna add a fixed name coming from our result, and we're gonna read out the name, and then changing the image, and that's gonna be a combination of the thumbnail that we have in our class. So we're gonna add it like this, and it means equals the ad results equals add bracket, should work, thumbnail, come on, thumbnail dot path. Oh, I'm forgetting my curly bracket, that's why I didn't recognize it at first. Followed by another result. There we go, that's better. Thumbnail extension. And as you can see, it's really trying to help me here. I actually enjoy it, because typing in all these complex characters, curly braces, non-curly braces, but I think this should be about it. Oh, and we already had those, so we don't need this one, and we don't need all that anymore. Good. So technically, again, just a little recap. What it's doing here is, instead of having that fixed URL, and that's obviously depending on the API response, but the way the Marvel API is handling it is part of that image URL is the path together with an extension, because it's typically showing you different image formats. Next, we're going to pull out the name, and then last, the character details will be our result description. So we can replace the character with result description. Way cool. And it is complaining about something. If Marvel result equals null, we have that if statement. Oh yeah, it removed it because I didn't accept that suggestion. Makes sense. I added it at the end, but all good. I think that's pretty much it. So let's give it a try. I'm gonna run, and if everything works out fine, we should get our web page up and running again. And next to that, when we search for one of our Marvel superheroes, it should actually provide some nice images and some descriptions. So the app is loading, that's always good. We're gonna search for Wolverine or part of the name. Remember, name starts with, and dun, 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 dun. Find the Marvel, and we got a nice feedback. So we have at least some feedback. As you can see here, we got different results coming in. We got more Wolverine from the series, we got Wolverine from the movies, we got Wolverine from the Lego, and if there's no image coming in from the Marvel payload itself, it's actually still picking up. Instead of using that placeholder image that I used at the start of developing the little app, it's now showing an image not found coming in from the Marvel API response as well. Let's give another try and search for, let's do spider, find the Marvel character, and we got some other new results coming in. Way cool. So we have Spider-Girl, we have Spider-Girl in a different variation, Spider-Man in a whole bunch of variations, but looks like we have everything up and running. Now I'm gonna stop here for now because the app is working. I mean, obviously you can add it and extending it with a lot of more functionalities coming in from Marvel. There are some updates that you can do out of the navigation menu over here. I'm just using the default one because in the end it's just like a quick session, you could say. Now in the corresponding blog post and the sample code I have on GitHub, you can actually add a second page, and what I'm doing there is flipping the cards. So it's a little bit of extra CSS integration that instead of just showing a static web page, it allows you to flip the card whenever you're hovering over it. But for now, because it's not really changing anything in the core code that I wanted to walk you through, I'm not really gonna add it from here because it's just copy pasting CSS, so it's nothing too fancy. Now, as a good developer, I would say when you know everything is working as it should be, it's about time to move this into source control, right? And then eventually we're gonna publish the app into Azure Application Services. So what we're gonna do here is adding source control. Technically, I should actually have done this at the start and then maybe committing some changes. And if you want, you could move this to like a full open source project, which, hey, maybe by the way, we could actually do that. Moving this into a full community source, open source project, why not? Where anyone could actually contribute to it would actually be pretty cool. So I'm gonna create a new GitHub repo. I'm gonna call it the Festive Blazor 2022 Live. And I'm gonna push all the code that I have. Now remember, there's technically some other updates I could recommend, like maybe storing that API key in some secret variable, and then maybe at some point pulling it out from like Azure App Configuration, or maybe maybe Azure Key Vault. Although technically, since we're using the Blazor WebAssembly, it's not allowing you to interact with Key Vault because it needs an API backend. So that's where that ASP.NET hosted alternative could actually be beneficial, but I don't really need it for the core of my application. So let's check and see what's happening here. This is the first one, so I'm gonna call it init, initialize, why not? Initialized working app. And commit the changes. And then it's created, and we're gonna run the push, and then eventually it should show up on the GitHub site. There we go, Festive Blazor 2022 Live, nice. It's probably still pushing, but we can already see that there is some information coming in. And then obviously, like any other open source project, the recommendation would be to actually add a little README into it. Cool, but this works. So now that we have our app up and running, I think it's about time to actually publish it. And that's where I'm gonna jump into Azure Static Web Apps. So the different stages for this piece is, first of all, saving the project in GitHub source control. Technically, it could also be Azure DevOps, but I just wanted to stretch it a little bit into GitHub. Then eventually deploying or creating Azure Static Web App resource in Azure and publishing code using GitHub Actions. And that's pretty much all we have to do. So let's have a look at this little piece. So let's static web app. And the nice thing is that it comes with a direct integration with GitHub and GitHub Actions to actually pick up the source code and publishing it. So we basically get a full CI/CD pipeline engine right out of the box. Static web app, where we need to identify some subscription details. So let's do the Festive Blazor resource group. We need to provide a name, Festive Blazor 2022 Live. It's a free project, it's on GitHub, and the last thing we need to do here is pointing to our Festive Blazor Live repo, the main branch, and identifying what kind of web application we're hosting. So there is a Blazor integration here. Now the only change we need to make is that by design, it assumes that you're publishing ASP.NET, which means there's a client server and shared project. Since we only have the client, we don't need to specify it. And we need to identify that the source code of my application is already in the root. And the W root is our output location. That's totally fine. Then reviewing it, and then eventually creating it. Once the web app is up and running, it's pushing back to GitHub and creating a GitHub action pipeline. So this part is done. If we browse to that dynamic generated URL, it's already showing the static, like the homepage of the placeholder, where next we can switch back, and within our GitHub environment, it's already running the action pipeline. So this shouldn't take more than just a couple of minutes, after which we can test if our app is still running fine on the Azure side. We can actually look in the details of the pipeline itself and validating what's actually happening. So you can see here that it is already publishing the source code. So probably another 30-40 seconds or so, and then we should have our app up and running. As you can see, the job is completed, which means if we're now switching back to our web application, we have the app up and running. Awesome. So from here, everything is working as it should be. So with that, I think my job is done for now. I'm gonna try and enjoy a little bit more of the holidays, but we got a little app developed in Blazor WebAssembly, connecting to an external API and publishing in Azure Static Web Apps. Enjoy the rest of the festive tech calendar, enjoy the holidays, and hopefully seeing you next year again. Thank you for now, and have a nice rest of your day. Awesome, this worked. I would like to thank you first of all for watching my session. I hope you enjoyed, I hope you learned a little bit about Blazor Server, Blazor WebAssembly, and enjoyed my fantastic coding experience, where honestly, this was one of my first sort of live codings. I think it's the first session actually recorded my development work. If you got any additional questions, feel free to reach out on Twitter, PDTIT, or pdtit.mastodon.social might actually be a good one to add here as well. Send me an email. If you want, you can follow me on my blog. And with that, I would say happy holidays, everyone. Enjoy the rest of festive calendar and enjoy the rest of the last couple of days in the year. Hopefully seeing you back next year. Thank you for now and enjoy the rest of your day.